October on the Low Dakota claims tastes like iron and wet soil. The grass has gone brittle under the first frost, but the ground beneath it is still breathing, pushing damp upward through every surface that sits on it, sweating through packed dirt the way stone sweats in a cellar. Chimney smoke from a half-finished cabin flattens under a gray sky and goes nowhere. A woman kneels inside, pressing her bare palm to the floor beside a cooling stove. When she lifts her hand, the skin glistens. Along the base of the east wall, frost is climbing the boards from below, an inch higher than yesterday. The claim sat 2 miles from the shallow bend of the Cheyenne River and 18 miles from the nearest rail stop, and the woman walking toward it in October of 1887 carried everything she owned in a trunk, a flour sack, and the grip of a 6-year-old boy who had not spoken since his father's funeral. Marit Brecka was 29 years old. She had been a seamstress in Fargo, and before that, a midwife's helper in Telemark, and before that, a girl who watched her father lay birch bark between stone and timber in a country she would never see again. None of those skills taken alone could keep 3 people alive through a Dakota winter, but she did not yet know which skill would matter most. Her husband, Oddman Brecka, had filed the claim the previous spring. He had cut logs for the north and west walls, raised them with a neighbor's help, and patched the south and east walls with salvaged board from a collapsed freight shed. He had cleared a site for a root cellar that he never dug. He had stacked 1 1/4 cords of split wood against the west wall, which was enough to heat the cabin for perhaps 3 weeks if the stove drew well, and the wind stayed modest. Then a wagon axle slipped its pin during a freight run, crushed his ribs against the wheel hub, and killed him in 4 hours on the side of a road that did not have a name. Marit learned about the death from a man she had never met, who rode to Fargo with Oddman's hat and $11 in coin that had been in his coat pocket. The man also brought the deed paper and a store account showing $31 owed to Jonas Pike's general store for nails, flour, lamp oil, and a pane of glass that had cracked during delivery, but Pike charged for anyway. $11 in hand, $31 in debt, a cabin with 2 finished walls and 2 patched ones, a dirt floor because Oddman had never gotten around to raising joists, 1 milk cow, old but still giving, a boy who needed boots, a younger sister Eli, 19 years old, who had followed Marit west and was now coughing through every night with a rattle that sounded like paper tearing. Marit did the math on the back of the deed paper during the wagon ride to the claim. She wrote small because the margins were narrow and the pencil was dull. The numbers did not argue. They simply refused to add up. She needed 6 cords of wood to survive a full winter. She had 1 1/4. Cordwood from the nearest supplier cost $4 a cord delivered, but she had no way to receive delivery because the trail to the claim washed out after autumn rains, and no teamster would risk an axle on that grade for a widow's credit. She could cut her own wood if she had an axe that held an edge, a crosscut saw, and the strength to fell, buck, split, and stack 5 more cords in the weeks before the ground froze. She had an axe. She did not have a saw. She did not have the weeks. The cabin, when she reached it, looked worse than Oddman's letters had described. The log walls on the north and west were solid enough, squared timbers chinked with mud and straw, but the board walls on the south and east had gaps where the wood had shrunk. Wind came through those gaps, carrying dust in dry weather and rain in wet. The roof was sawed over poles which kept out wind but let in water wherever the sod had settled unevenly. The floor was packed dirt, dark with damp, and it smelled like the underside of a rock. Tolliff stood in the doorway and looked at the floor. Eli sat on the trunk and coughed. Marit set the flour sack on the only shelf and pressed her palm flat against the dirt beside the stove. The dirt was cold and wet, not damp the way a cellar is damp, wet the way a riverbank is wet, as though the ground itself were breathing water upward into the cabin. She wiped her hand on her skirt and did not say what she was thinking, which was that the floor would freeze before Christmas and they would be sleeping on ice. 3 days after Marit arrived, Rufus Calder rode up the grade on a brown mare with a clipboard tied to his saddle. Calder was 58, the township road supervisor, a former Army teamster who had spent 11 years moving supply wagons across terrain that did not want wagons on it. He had a beard the color of old rope and a way of looking at structures that made them feel smaller. He had come to assess the dwelling because the county required it before winter, and because he had liked Odmund and felt he owed the dead man's wife an honest verdict. Calder did not knock. He walked the perimeter first, pressing his thumb into the chinking on the log walls, pulling at a board on the south side until it flexed, and standing at the northeast corner where the ground sloped toward the cabin instead of away from it. Then he came inside. He stood on the dirt floor for perhaps 10 seconds without speaking. Marit watched him look at the stove, at the roof poles, at the gap under the south door where light showed, and at the dark stain along the base of the east wall where water had been wicking upward into the boards. Calder said, "You have half a frame and 2 good walls." Marit said she knew. Calder said, "You have maybe 1 1/4 cord stacked. You need 6 minimum, more if January runs long." Marit said she had calculated the same. Calder crouched and pressed his own palm to the dirt floor, the way Marit had done 3 days earlier. He held it there for a moment, then wiped it on his knee. He said, "Damp dirt steals heat faster than wind through chinks. You can plug every gap in these walls, and that stove will still lose half its work to the ground. A man with money puts in a plank floor raised 10 inches above grade. A man with less money digs a ditch on 3 sides to pull the water table down. A man with nothing—" He stopped. Marit said, "A man with nothing does what?" Calder stood up. He looked at Tollef, who was sitting on the trunk holding a piece of kindling like it was something valuable. He looked at Eli, who was lying on the sleeping platform with a cloth over her mouth. Calder said, "A man with nothing sells the cow, takes rooms in town for the winter, and lets Pike buy the low acres in spring. That's the honest answer." Marit said the cow was not for sale. Calder said, "The cow's worth $8 if you sell it now. By February, it's worth 4, and by March, it's dead and worth nothing, and so are you." He did not say it cruelly. His voice was level, the way a man speaks when he has seen enough frozen cabins to know what the numbers mean. He told her the rest of the math as though reading from the clipboard. She needed a ditch dug on 3 sides of the cabin, which required a man with a spade and 8 days of labor. She needed the south and east walls replanked or double-boarded, which required lumber she could not afford. She needed the dirt floor raised or replaced, which required joists, planks, and a man who knew how to set them. She needed all of this done before the ground froze in late November, and it was already the 3rd week of October. Marit asked him how much it would cost to hire the labor. Calder said, "More than $11." He folded his clipboard under his arm. At the door he turned and said one more thing. He said, "Stubborn keeps you warm until December. It doesn't keep you warm after that." The door closed. Marit listened to his mare's hooves on the hard ground until the sound disappeared. Then she knelt on the dirt floor and pressed both palms flat against it, feeling the cold rise through her skin like a promise. Tollef said, "Mama, is the floor supposed to be wet?" Marit said, "No." That was the only conversation they had about it, but the question stayed in the room like a guest who would not leave. The floor was wet. The floor was not supposed to be wet, and every solution anyone could name cost money, labor, and time that Marit did not have. She could not leave. The claim was the only property in her name. If she abandoned it before proving up, the homestead reverted, and Pike would buy the debt, the cow, and whatever Odmund had built. Passage east to Fargo cost $6 for 3 people, and Fargo had no work waiting and no family to receive them. Passage farther east to Minnesota or Wisconsin cost more than everything she owned. Eli was too sick to travel in an open wagon. Tollef had no boots that fit, and winter was 5 weeks away. The escape hatches were sealed. The math was brutal. And every morning when Marit woke, the blankets were damper than the night before, and the frost line along the base of the east wall had climbed another inch. The idea did not come as inspiration. It came as a question asked by her own body. 2 weeks after Calder's visit, on a night when the stove had been burning steadily for 4 hours, Marit woke because her hip ached. She had been sleeping on the platform Oddman built, rough planks on log rounds, raised 18 inches off the dirt. But Eli had the platform now because her cough was worse when she lay flat, and Marit had moved to a pallet on the floor so Tolef could sleep beside his aunt. Marit rolled onto her back and felt the cold pressing up through the pallet, through the folded blanket beneath it, through the straw she had packed between the blanket and the dirt. The stove was still warm. The air in the cabin was not freezing, but the ground beneath her was pulling heat out of her body the way a river pulls heat out of a wading foot, steadily, patiently, without stopping. She sat up and pressed her palm to the dirt beside the pallet. The surface was wet, not muddy, not puddled, just wet, the way stone sweats in a cellar when warm air meets cold mass. She moved her hand to the edge of the stove's heat circle where the dirt should have been warmest. It was damp there, too. And then she understood something she had known without words since childhood. The floor was not just cold, it was a conduit. The damp ground beneath the cabin was pulling warmth downward and pushing moisture upward in a cycle that no amount of firewood could defeat. She could burn 6 cords or 60. As long as the ground was open and wet, the cabin would lose heat through the floor faster than the stove could replace it. The memory came then, not as a decision, but as a sensation. Her father's workshop in Telemark, the smell of pine pitch warming on an iron plate, and the feeling of cold stone under her bare feet as she watched him lay strips of white birch bark between the foundation stones and the timber sill of a neighbor's house. She had been 7 or 8 years old. Her father had said something she did not fully understand at the time. He had said, "The bark does not keep the cold out. It keeps the wet out. Dry wood holds warmth. Wet wood steals it." He had poured a cup of water onto a piece of bark laid flat on the stone sill. Marit had watched the water bead and slide sideways instead of soaking through. Her father had pressed his thumb against the underside of the bark and shown her dry. The stone beneath was dry. The water had gone sideways instead of down. On the floor of a half-finished cabin in Dakota Territory, 22 years later, Marit Brika pressed her wet palm against her skirt and thought about birch bark. Not as insulation, not as a wall covering, not as kindling or basket material or any of the other uses she had seen. As a floor, a layer between her family and the wet ground, a surface that refused water and forced it sideways instead of upward. She did not yet know whether there were birch trees along the Cheyenne River. She did not yet know how much bark she would need, or how to flatten it, or how to seal the seams, or whether the idea was anything more than a memory pressed into desperation. But she knew the principle. She had watched water bead on bark and slide off, and she had felt dry stone beneath. In the morning, she told Eli to keep the stove fed and Tolef close. She pulled on Oddmund's coat, which was too large for her and smelled like axle grease and sweat that would never refresh, and she walked toward the river. The Cheyenne's near bank held alder and willow mostly, thin stuff good for nothing but basket weaving and kindling. But a quarter-mile upstream, where the ground rose slightly before dropping into an oxbow, Marit found what she needed. A stand of white birch, perhaps 30 trees. Most of them alive, but several dead or fallen. The fallen trunks still wore their bark in loose, curling sheets. The dead standing trees had bark that was tight but dry and beginning to separate at the edges. She peeled a piece from a fallen trunk. It came away in a sheet 18 inches wide and almost 2 feet long, pale on the outside, layered and papery on the inner face. She rolled it carefully, the way she had seen her father handle bark in Telemark, white side out, gentle pressure, no sharp creases. She carried 6 rolls back to the cabin and spread them on the floor near the stove. The first experiment was simple. She laid 2 sheets flat on the dirt, overlapping the edges by 4 inches, and placed a cup of melted snow on top. She waited. After an hour, she lifted the bark. The dirt beneath the overlap was dry. The dirt 6 inches beyond the bark's edge was wet. It was not proof. It was not a floor. But it was a principle confirmed by a cup of water, and Marit felt something shift in her chest that she had not felt since Oddman died. Not hope, exactly. Recognition. The feeling of seeing a problem and knowing, not believing, knowing that a tool existed to address it. She spent the rest of the day calculating. The cabin floor was 16 by 18 feet, 288 square feet. With overlap of 4 inches on every seam, she needed roughly 300 square feet of bark, which meant harvesting, flattening, and laying approximately 50 sheets of varying size. She would need pine pitch to seal the seams. She had seen pitch pines along the river, and dry sand to cover the surface and protect the bark from boot soles, stove sparks, and the scraping of furniture. The plan looked like this: bark on dirt, seams sealed with heated pitch, sand over everything, a floor that was not wood but acted like wood's most important quality. It refused water. She did not tell Eli the full plan. She told her only that she was gathering bark. Eli looked at the rolls drying near the stove and said nothing, which was worse than questions because it meant Eli thought the idea was too fragile to challenge. Barrett Hogan arrived the next afternoon. Barrett was 34, a neighboring settler 3/4 of a mile east, mother of 4 children ranging from 11 years old down to 3. Her husband had a full cabin with a plank floor and 4 cords stacked, which made Beret's situation survivable in a way Marit's was not. Beret was practical in the way that people who have barely enough become practical, generous with advice, cautious with resources, and suspicious of anything that looked like gambling. She found Marit at the river, stripping bark from a dead birch trunk with a knife. Beret said, "What are you doing with bark?" Marit explained. She described the wet floor, the frost climbing the east wall, the heat disappearing into damp ground. She described her father's method in telemark. She described the cup of water beating on the bark and the dry dirt beneath. Beret listened with her arms crossed, which Marit had already learned meant Beret was calculating, not refusing. When Marit finished, Beret said, "Bark is for canoes and baskets and kindling. I've never heard of anyone putting it on a floor." Marit said, "My father put it between stone and timber." Beret said, "Your father had stone and timber. You have dirt." Marit said the principle was the same. Stop the water before it enters the living space. Beret uncrossed her arms and looked at the bark rolls. She said, "How many days has this taken you?" Marit said 2 days so far. Barrett said, "In 2 days you could have hauled half a cord from the deadfall east of Calder's fence line. Half a cord is 2 more weeks of heat. Bark scraps on dirt is not 2 weeks of heat." Marit said, "If the floor stays wet, 6 cords will not be enough. The heat goes into the ground and disappears." Beret said, "And if the bark does nothing, you've lost 2 days you cannot get back, and your boy still has no boots." She was not wrong. That was the problem with Beret's skepticism. It was grounded in the arithmetic of survival that every woman on the claim line understood. Every hour had a cost. Every day spent on an unproven idea was a day not spent on proven work. Firewood was proven. A hauled cord was a hauled cord. Bark on a dirt floor was a guess, and guesses did not keep children warm. Marit said, "I know the risk." Beret said, "Do you?" "Because I've watched 2 women lose claims in 3 winners, and neither one of them thought she was guessing either." She left without helping and without offering to help, which Marit respected because Beret had 4 children of her own and no surplus to share with anyone's experiment. But the conversation cost Marit something she could not afford to lose: certainty. Beret's math was correct. 2 days of bark gathering was 2 days not spent on fuel. The floor experiment was unproven, and if it failed, those days were gone, and winter was 2 days closer. Marit sat on a fallen trunk beside the river and looked at the bark rolls in her arms. 12 sheets. Maybe 40 square feet if she was lucky. She needed 300. She calculated the remaining time. It was early November. Hard freeze typically came in late November or early December. She had perhaps 4 weeks of workable weather. In 4 weeks, she needed to gather and prepare 300 square feet of bark, collect and heat enough pine pitch to seal 50 or more seams, haul enough dry sand to cover the entire floor to a depth of 1 inch, and continue cutting and stacking firewood because the bark floor, even if it worked perfectly, could not replace fuel entirely. 4 weeks, 1 woman, 2 dependents who could help only in small ways. No horse, no saw, no money. She stood up and walked back to the river and peeled another sheet of bark from the fallen trunk. The strip came away clean, 20 inches wide, and Marit rolled it carefully and added it to the pile. She could not afford the experiment. She also could not afford the floor as it was. Jonas Pike came to the cabin on the second Sunday of November, 4 days after Buries' visit. He arrived in a buckboard with his name painted on the side, Pike General Supply, and he brought a small sack of flour as a gesture of concern that was not concern at all. Pike was 46, lean-faced, with hands that stayed clean because he paid other men to do work that dirtied them. He owned the only general store within 12 miles. He held credit accounts for most of the claims in the valley, and he had been buying distressed homesteads for 3 years. His method was simple. He extended credit during autumn when settlers needed supplies. He collected during spring when they were weakest. If they could not pay, he took the claim at a discount and resold the acreage to ranchers or speculators. Marit's claim interested him because the low ground along the Cheyenne Bend was poor for a house, but excellent for hay in dry years. Pike had told Odmund as much when Odmund was alive. Odmund had told Pike the land was not for sale. Pike had said all land was for sale eventually. He stepped into the cabin without waiting for Marit to invite him. He looked at the stove, the sleeping platform, the shelf with its small collection of supplies, and the bark rolls stacked against the wall near the door. Pike said, "I brought flour. You're low, I expect." Marit said she was grateful. Pike set the flour on the shelf and turned to face her. He said, "I see bark. Are you weaving baskets?" Marit said no. Pike said, "Selling to the Indian traders?" Marit said no. Pike walked to the bark rolls and nudged one with his boot. He said, "Your account is at $31. I'm carrying you because Odmund was reliable, but I need to see a path to payment before the ground freezes." Marit said she intended to prove up on the claim and make payment from the spring planting. Pike said, "Spring planting requires seed, which requires money, which requires credit, which requires that I believe the person asking will still be here in the spring." He let that settle. Then he said, "I'll buy the cow against $20 of the debt. That leaves 11 owing, which I'll carry until June if you sign over the low acres as security." Marit said the low acres were part of the claim, and she would not sign them over. Pike said, "Marit, the low acres flood every other spring. They're useless to you." Marit said, "If they're useless, why do you want them?" Pike's expression did not change. He was not a man who showed frustration. He showed patience, which was worse because his patience meant he believed time was on his side. He said, "I'm offering you a way to reduce your debt and keep the cabin. Stubborn women make orphans before spring." Marit noticed that Pike had used the same word Calder had used, stubborn. As though the men in this valley had one word for a woman who would not do what they advised, and the word carried a season's worth of threat. She said, "I won't sell the cow. I won't sign the acres. I'll make payment in the spring." Pike looked at the bark rolls one more time. He said, "What is the bark for?" Marit said, "The floor." Pike said, "The dirt floor." Marit said yes. Pike looked at the dirt floor. He looked at the bark. He did something with his mouth that was not quite a smile. He said, "You're papering the dirt like it's a parlor wall." He picked up the empty flour sack he had brought and folded it under his arm. At the door, he said, "I'll check the account in January. If you've left, I'll take what I'm owed." He left. The buckboard rattled down the grade. Marit stood in the cabin holding the small sack of flour that was not a gift and listening to the sound of his wheels on the frozen ruts. Tolaf, who had been sitting behind the stove during the entire conversation, said, "Mama, what's a parlor wall?" Marit said, "It's a wall in a room that people only use when they want to show visitors they have nice things." Tolaf said, "We don't have nice things." Marit said, "No, we don't." She put the flour on the shelf beside the other flour. She looked at the bark rolls. She looked at the dirt floor. The damp had crawled another half-inch up the east wall overnight. Pike's phrase would travel. She knew it as certainly as she knew the frost was coming. By the end of the week, everyone within 6 miles would know that Marit Brecka was papering the dirt like it was a parlor wall, and they would laugh because the image was easy to laugh at, and because laughing at a widow's strange idea was easier than helping her. She picked up a bark roll and carried it to the stove. She unrolled it slowly, warming it near the heat until the stiff edges began to relax. Then she carried it to the northeast corner of the cabin, where the damp was worst, and laid it flat on the dirt. She pressed the edges down with her hands. She measured 4 inches of overlap from the wall. She cut the bark with Oddman's knife, trimming the edge straight. She heated a lump of pine pitch in a cracked kettle until it softened, spread it along the seam with a rag-wrapped thumb, and pressed the bark flat. The pitch smelled like the forest. The bark felt smooth and stiff under her fingers. The dirt beneath it was already beginning to feel different, not warmer, but less actively cold. Less greedy. 20 square feet. 268 to go. Outside, the sky was the color of a plow blade, and the wind was turning north. If someone has ever looked at your work and dismissed what they didn't understand, tell us about it in the comments. We want to hear that story. The next morning, Marit walked to the river and found that someone had stripped bark from the same fallen trunk she had been working. The cuts were clean, made with a tool sharper than her knife, and the sheets had been taken whole, not torn. She followed the footprints, moccasin tracks, pressed firm into the mud, and found them leading upstream along the bank, then cutting inland toward the bluff. She did not follow farther, but she studied the cuts on the trunk. Whoever had taken bark had cut around the knots instead of through them, which left wider, unblemished sheets. Marit had been cutting through knots and losing bark to splits. She filed the observation and went back to work. 3 days later, she tore a sheet while trying to flatten it cold. The bark split along a worm channel she had not seen, and the piece, a good 2 feet wide, cracked in half and became useless for floor work. She could still burn it or use it for small patches, but she had spent 40 minutes harvesting and carrying it, and those 40 minutes were gone. She was kneeling on the cabin floor, trying to fit the cracked pieces together like a puzzle, when a voice came from the doorway. The voice said, "You're flattening it cold. Deadfall bark must be warmed first." Marit looked up. The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, perhaps older, with a face that had been weathered past the point where age could be read precisely. She wore a heavy wool coat over a dress that mixed settler fabric with beadwork at the cuffs, and her hair was braided and wrapped with dark cloth. She carried a basket on one arm and a bundle of bark strips on the other. Marit said, "I'm sorry." The woman stepped inside without being invited, the way Calder and Pike had stepped inside, except that she removed her muddy footwear at the threshold and set it beside the door. She said, "Deadfall bark dries and stiffens. If you bend it cold, it cracks at the worm channels and the knot scars. Warm it near the stove first. Not on the stove. Near it. Let it remember what it was before it dried." She set her basket on the floor and crouched beside the cracked piece Marit was holding. She pressed her thumb along the split. She said, "This bark was good. You lost it to impatience." Marit said, "Who are you?" The woman said her name was Nokomis Bineshi. She was Ojibwe and Métis. She had been mending canoes, weaving bark, and trading basket work, medicines, and repaired harness with settlers along the Cheyenne for longer than most settlers had been here. She had seen Marit at the river, cutting bark badly, and had watched for 3 days before deciding whether to speak. Marit said, "You watched me for 3 days?" Nokomi said, "I needed to see whether you were stealing lazily or working seriously. Lazy people I leave alone. Serious people I correct." She took the cracked bark piece from Marit's hands, carried it to the stove, and held it at arm's length from the iron surface. After a minute, she bent it gently. The bark flexed without cracking. She said, "The heat does not make it soft. It makes it willing." Marit watched. She said, "The bark I found already stripped upstream. That was you." Nokomi said, "I cut around the knots. You cut through them. That is why your sheets crack and mine do not." She looked at the floor. Marit had laid perhaps 30 square feet of bark in the northeast corner, sealed with pitch and covered lightly with sand. Nokomis walked to the edge of the laid section and crouched. She pressed her palm to the bark surface. She pressed her palm to the bare dirt beside it. She stood without commenting on the temperature difference, which Marit took as a sign that the difference did not need commenting on. Nokomi said, "Why are you putting bark on the floor?" Marit explained, "The damp, the heat loss." Her father's method in telemark, the cup of water beating on bark and sliding sideways. Nokomis listened without interrupting. When Marit finished, Nokomis said, "Your father understood one piece. The bark sheds water. But you are missing 2 other pieces, and without them, this floor will fail before January." Marit said, "What 2 pieces?" Nokomi said, "I will show you, but not today. Today you learn to cut bark without destroying it." She spent the next 2 hours teaching Mary to harvest from deadfall. The lessons were physical, not verbal. Nokomis placed Marit's hands on the trunk and showed her where to start the cut, at the edge of a natural seam where the bark was already beginning to separate. She showed her the angle of the knife, shallow, almost flat, following the curve of the wood rather than fighting it. She showed her how to use the heel of her hand to peel the sheet back gradually, keeping tension even so the bark separated in one piece instead of tearing. By the end of the afternoon, Marit had harvested 4 sheets without a single crack. They were wider and cleaner than anything she had managed alone. Nokomis rolled them carefully, white side out, and said, "Tomorrow I will show you seam logic. Your seams are wrong. You have laid them like blanket edges. They must be laid like roof shingles." Marit said, "What's the difference?" Nokomis said, "Water follows laziness. A blanket edge gives water a place to pool and seep. A shingle edge sends water away. Which direction do you want the damp to travel?" Marit said, "Away." Nokomis said, "Then you need shingles, not blankets." She picked up her basket, put her footwear on at the threshold, and walked out into the gray afternoon without saying goodbye. Marit stood in the doorway and watched her cross the yard and disappear down the grade toward the river path. Eli, from the sleeping platform, said, "Who was that?" Marit said, "Someone who knows bark better than I do." Eli said, "Does she think the floor will work?" Marit considered the question. Nokomis had not said whether she thought the floor would work. She had said the seams were wrong and the bark was being cut badly. She had corrected the cutting without being asked. She had promised to return. Marit said, "She thinks I'm doing it wrong. That's different from thinking it won't work." Eli coughed and pulled the blanket higher. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. Small flakes, dry and light, the kind that melted on skin and meant nothing yet. But behind them, to the north, the sky was a color that Marit recognized from Telemark. A color that meant the light snow was a messenger and the real snow was still coming. She closed the door. She fed the stove. She picked up a bark sheet, held it near the heat until it relaxed, and carried it to the floor. 20 square feet laid. 30 done by tomorrow if the seams held. 258 left, and the sky was darkening, and the ground beneath the cabin had not yet begun to freeze. It would freeze soon. When it did, the race would be over. Either the floor was finished, or it was not. Marit pressed the bark flat. She spread pitch with her thumb. She covered the seam with sand. Outside, the snow thickened, and the first real cold of the season pressed its hands against the walls. Nokomis returned the next morning before the light was fully up. She carried a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and set it on the floor without explanation. Inside were 6 sheets of birch bark, wider and more uniform than anything Marit had harvested, and a small clay pot sealed with a leather cap. She opened the pot and held it near the stove. The smell that rose from it was pine pitch mixed with something richer, animal fat, and beneath that, a grit like fine ash. Marit said, "What is that?" Nokomi said, "Pitch alone cracks in cold. It contracts and pulls away from the bark edges. By January, your seams will be open and the damp will come through." She dipped a flat stick into the warmed mixture and drew a line along the edge of a bark sheet. The mixture spread more smoothly than the raw pitch Marit had been using. It gripped the bark surface and did not bead up or slide. Nokomi said, "Pitch, tallow, and ash. The tallow keeps the pitch from going brittle. The ash gives it something to hold. My grandmother used this on canoe seams in Lac de Flambeau. The canoes stayed dry through 3 seasons." Mari reached for the stick. Nokomis pulled it back. Nokomi said, "First you fix the seams you have already laid. They are wrong." She walked to the northeast corner where Marit had placed her first 30 square feet of bark. She crouched and ran her finger along a seam where 2 pieces overlapped. She pressed down. A thin line of moisture welled up at the edge. Nokomi said, "You laid these flat edge to flat edge, blanket seams. Water finds the joint and sits in it. Now look." She took 2 pieces of bark from her bundle and laid them on the dirt beside the existing work. She overlapped them by 4 inches, but instead of aligning the edges evenly, she staggered them so that the upper piece extended past the lower piece like a shingle on a roof. Then she tilted the lower piece slightly, pressing its far edge into the dirt so that gravity would pull any moisture away from the seam and toward the wall. She said, "Water is lazy. It follows the easiest path. If you give it a downhill path away from the living space, it takes that path. If you give it a flat joint, it pools there and waits for cold to push it through." Marit said, "I need to tear up everything I've laid?" Nokomi said, "You need to tear up everything you've laid." Marit closed her eyes for a moment. 30 square feet, 3 days of work, gone. She opened her eyes and said, "Show me how to do it right." They spent the entire day relaying the northeast corner. Nokomis worked beside Marit, not above her. She did not lecture. She placed bark, sealed seams, and let Marit watch the technique until Marit could replicate it. When Marit's seams were crooked, Nokomis pulled them up and waited while Marit redid them. When the pitch mixture cooled and thickened, Nokomis showed Marit how to warm it again without burning the tallow out of it. By late afternoon, They had relaid 32 square feet with proper shingle overlaps, pitch tallow ash seams, and a quarter-inch of dry sand brushed over the surface. Nokomis tested it. She poured a cup of snowmelt onto the sand near a seam. The water soaked into the sand, hit the bark, and ran sideways along the shingle edge toward the wall. The dirt beneath the bark was dry. The dirt beyond the bark's edge, where the water eventually reached bare ground, was wet. Nokomi said, "That is what right looks like." She gathered her oilcloth, her clay pot, and her tools. At the door, she said, "I will come when I can. I am not your worker, but I will teach you what the bark knows because you are listening to it, and most people do not." Marit said, "Why does it matter to you?" Nokomi stood in the doorway with the gray sky behind her and said, "Because the bark is not yours. It is not mine. It belongs to the tree that made it. If you are going to take it from the tree and put it to use, you should know how to use it properly. Otherwise, you are just wasting what the tree gave." She left. Marit stood over the relayed corner and pressed her palm to the sand. Dry. Beneath the sand, bark. Beneath the bark, dirt that was no longer feeding moisture upward into the living space. 32 square feet, 256 to go. The days that followed were measured in bark. November 6th, Marit harvested 12 sheets from the deadfall upstream, cutting around knots the way Nokomis had shown her. She warmed each sheet near the stove before flattening. No cracks. 80 square feet laid by nightfall. November 9th, Nokomis arrived with a second pot of pitch mixture and showed Marit how to make her own. The proportions were not precise: a fist-sized lump of pine pitch, a thumb's width of rendered tallow scraped from the inside of a deer hide, and a palmful of hardwood ash sifted through cloth until it was fine as flour. Marit heated the pitch first, stirred in the tallow until it melted through, then folded in the ash until the mixture stopped looking shiny and started looking like dark mud. 104 square feet done. November 12th. Tollef began helping. He could not lay bark or handle hot pitch, but he could sift sand through a piece of sacking and carry it in a bucket to where Marit was working. One bucket of sifted sand covered roughly 4 square feet to the right depth. Tollef carried 11 buckets that day without being asked, which meant 44 square feet of coverage. Marit's hands were blistered along both thumbs, where the pitch rag had rubbed the skin raw, and her knees ached from hours of pressing seams. 130 square feet. Halfway. November 14th. Eli, between coughing fits, kept sand drying in pans near the stove. Wet sand was useless. It held moisture instead of shedding it, which would defeat the entire purpose of the barrier. Dry sand absorbed minor spills from above, protected the bark from abrasion, and gave the floor a surface that looked like dirt and felt like ground, but was, underneath, sealed against the thing that was trying to kill them. 152 square feet. November 16th. A warm rain came through and turned the yard to black paste. Water ran under the south door and across 3 feet of bare dirt before reaching the edge of the laid bark. The bark held. The water stopped at the sealed edge and pooled on the bare dirt instead of penetrating the seams. But the bare dirt section, the half of the floor not yet covered, turned to mud. Marit spent 2 hours scraping mud and relaying sand that had washed into brown slurry. She lost a day. 152 square feet still, and now the deadline pressed harder. November 18th. One of the bark rolls stored against the east wall had molded. Gray-green fur spread across the inner surface where the bark had been pressed against the damp boards. Marit peeled the mold away, but the bark beneath was soft and punky. Useless. She had stored it too close to the wall, too far from the stove's heat. Nokomi's had not warned her about storage because Nokomi stored bark in dry places and did not think to mention what was obvious to anyone who had worked with bark for 50 years. 14 square feet of prepared bark gone. Marit sat on the floor and looked at the molded sheet. Eli watched from the platform. Toluf watched from behind the stove. Marit said a word in Norwegian that Eli pretended not to hear. Then she picked up the knife and went back to the river. On November 20th, Pike refused to extend credit for lamp oil. Marit had asked for a single quart because the evenings were darkening earlier and she needed light to seal seams after Toluf went to sleep. Pike said her account was at its limit and he could not justify further extension. Marit said she would pay for the oil with work, mending, sewing, anything. Pike said, "I don't need mending. I need the $31 you owe." Marit left the store without oil. She worked by firelight after that, which was harder on her eyes and slower because the flickering made it difficult to see whether the pitch was spreading evenly, 170 square feet. On November 22nd, Bere Haugen's eldest daughter, a quiet girl of 11 named Sigrid, left a sack of dry sand at Marit's door without knocking. The sack held perhaps 20 pounds, enough to cover 16 square feet. There was no note. The girl was gone by the time Marit opened the door. Marit understood what the sand meant. Beret still doubted the method. Beret still believed Marit was wasting days. But Beret did not want to see the children freeze, and a sack of sand cost nothing but the carrying. 186 square feet. November 25th. Nokomis came for the 4th time. She brought a tool Marit had not seen before, a curved bone scraper worn smooth on its working edge that Nokomis used to flatten stubborn seams without tearing the bark. She showed Marit how to use it. Hold the scraper at a low angle, press with the weight of the arm rather than the wrist, and drag slowly along the seam so the pitch was pressed into every gap. They worked together in silence for 3 hours. Nokomis did not speak unless correcting a technique. Marit did not speak because her hands hurt and her back ached, and talking used energy she needed for pressing seams. At the end of the 3rd hour, Nokomis said something that Marit did not expect. She said, "You have good hands." Marit looked at her hands. They were cracked, pitch-stained, blistered, and raw at the knuckle joints. Nokomis said, "I do not mean beautiful, I mean accurate. You place bark the way I mend canoe skin. You feel where the seam wants to go." Marit said, "My mother said I had sewing hands." Nokomis said, "Sewing and bark laying are the same work. You are closing a surface against what tries to come through." She paused. Then she said, "Your father taught you the principle, but you are doing the labor. The principle without the labor is just a memory. You are making it real." 214 square feet. Rufus Calder returned on the 28th of November. He came on foot this time, without the mare, walking the grade with his collar turned up against a wind that had shifted north during the night. He stood in the doorway and looked at the floor. More than 2/3 of the cabin's dirt surface was now covered in bark, sealed with dark pitch lines, and blanketed with pale sand. The uncovered section near the south door was still bare dirt, still damp, still cold. The covered section was dry. The difference was visible to anyone who looked, a clean border between 2 kinds of ground. Calder stepped onto the bark section. He stood there for a moment, shifting his weight. He crouched and pressed his palm to the sand the way he had pressed it to the bare dirt 5 weeks earlier. He brushed sand aside and touched the bark beneath. He lifted the edge of a sheet and looked at the dirt under it. He stood up. He said, "The dirt under the bark is dry." Marit said, "Yes." Calder said, "How long has this section been down?" Marit said the northeast corner had been laid for 3 weeks, the central section for 10 days. Calder said, "The dirt floor in my own barn is wetter than this." He walked to the bare section near the door and pressed his palm there. Wet. He walked back to the bark section and pressed again. Dry. He did this twice more, as though the difference might resolve itself into something he could dismiss. It did not. Calder said, "It's a canoe turned wrong side down." Nokomis, who had been sitting near the stove sorting bark strips, said without looking up, "A canoe knows which side the water belongs on." Calder looked at Nokomis. He looked at Marit. He said, "That's a pretty line, but winter is not a pretty line. A warm November and a cup of water are not January." Marit said, "I know." Calder said, "You're short on fuel. I count maybe 2 cords against that wall. You need 4 more at minimum." Marit said, "If the floor stays dry, I'll burn less than 6. Calder said, "That's a theory. Theories freeze." He left, but he did not tell Marit to sell the cow. He did not tell her to take rooms in town. He did not repeat the word stubborn. The omission was not kindness, exactly. It was the silence of a man whose verdict was no longer certain, and who was honest enough to stop speaking when his certainty ran out. 238 square feet, 50 to go. Marit finished the floor on the 4th of December. 288 square feet of packed dirt, covered in overlapping birch bark sheets laid like shingles, every seam sealed with a pitch tallow ash mixture, the entire surface blanketed in 1 inch of dry sand sifted by her son's hands and dried in pans by her sister's patience. The last section, the strip near the south door, was the hardest because the threshold leaked and the ground beneath stayed wetter longer. Marit laid double bark there, 2 layers instead of 1, with the seams staggered so that no gap in the upper layer aligned with a gap in the lower. She sealed both layers with extra pitch and covered them with coarser sand that would not wash away when snow blew under the door. She stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the floor. It looked like dirt, pale, sandy dirt, unremarkable, the kind of surface a visitor would glance at and forget. But beneath the sand was a membrane that had taken 6 weeks, 400 sheets of bark, 3 pots of pitch mixture, uncounted hours of labor, 2 blistered hands, 1 molded roll, 1 skeptic's assessment, 1 storekeeper's mockery, 1 neighbor's doubt, and 1 Ojibwe woman's knowledge to create. Marit pressed her palm to the floor. Dry. She pressed her palm to the wall at floor height. Dry. She checked the seam nearest the stove where heat might dry the pitch too fast and cause it to crack. The seam held. She checked the seam nearest the east wall where moisture pressure was strongest. Sealed. That night she moved her pallet back to the floor and slept on the bark for the first time. She woke once in the dark and reached out from under the blanket to touch the sand. It was cool, but not cold. It was dry. She went back to sleep and did not dream about the floor, which was how she knew the floor was done. December was mild, the kind of mild that made people careless. Temperatures that hovered just below freezing during the day and dropped to 10 or 15 below at night, cold enough to remind everyone that winter existed, but not cold enough to test anything. Chimneys smoked steadily. Children walked to school bundled, but not buried. Men hauled wood and broke ice on water troughs and spoke about spring as though it were already approaching instead of 4 months away. Marit tested her floor the only way she could. She let it work and watched for failure. She kept the stove low for 1 full night and checked the bedding in the morning. The air chilled. The blankets did not dampen. Flour sacks stored on the floor stayed dry for 2 days, then 3, then a week. A tin cup left under the sleeping platform, a test Nokomis had suggested, no longer beaded with condensation on its surface. In Merritt's old cabin experience, any cup left on a dirt floor would sweat within hours. This one stayed dry. Eli noticed first. She said, "The cough is better." Marit did not know whether the dry floor was the reason or whether Eli's lungs were simply healing on their own. But the bedding was dry. The air inside the cabin smelled like wood smoke and sand instead of mildew and damp earth, and Eli slept through 2 consecutive nights without coughing blood. Beret Haugen visited and stood on the bark floor with an expression Marit could not read. Beret said, "It feels different." Marit said, "It is different." Beret said, "December is not January." Calder, who heard about the floor from Beret, did not visit again, but he told a neighbor that the Brecca cabin had a dry floor and he could not explain it, which for Calder was the equivalent of admitting uncertainty. A man who could explain everything did not need to announce what he could not explain. The fact that he mentioned it at all meant the floor had entered his thinking and would not leave. Nokomis came once more before the year turned. She inspected every seam on her hands and knees, pressing her thumb along the pitch lines, checking the sand depth, feeling for damp spots where bark might have shifted or a seam might have opened. She found one seam near the stove that was beginning to dry and separate. She resealed it with fresh pitch mixture and told Marit to check that spot every week. She said, "The floor is not magic. If you let snow melt indoors and the water soaks the sand, the barrier fails from above. If seams dry out near the stove, the barrier fails from within. If the sand gets fouled with mud from boots, it holds moisture instead of shedding it. You must tend it the way you tend the stove. It does not forgive neglect." Marit said she understood. Nokomis said, "You understand with your mind. Your hands will understand by February." Then January came, and January was not December. The thaw arrived in the second week. Warm air from the south pushed temperatures above freezing for 3 consecutive days. Snow softened to slush. Ice in the ruts cracked and filled with brown water. Children walked to school with coats open. Women hung washing on lines for the first time in 6 weeks. Men said the winter was breaking early and maybe this year would be kind. Marit did not relax. She walked outside and looked at the ground around the cabin. The yard was a swamp. Meltwater pooled in every low spot. The grade that sloped toward the cabin from the northeast was running with snowmelt that had nowhere to go. She could see water standing in the ruts and seeping toward the foundation logs. She went inside and checked the floor. Dry. The bark was holding, but she understood what Nokomis had warned her about. The floor stopped moisture from below. It could not stop moisture that came in through the door, through boots, through melting snow carried on coats and dropped beside the stove. She told Tolef to stamp his boots clean before crossing the threshold. She placed a folded cloth at the doorway to catch melt. She checked the seams twice that day. The thaw worried her for a reason she could not yet fully name. Something about the warm air felt wrong. Not wrong like spring, which arrived slowly and stayed. Wrong like a held breath, like the silence between a lightning flash and the sound that follows. She looked at the sky. The gray had a yellow tinge along the northern horizon that she remembered from Telemark. Her father had called that color Ulva Himmel, wolf sky. It meant the weather was lying. On the morning of January 12, 1888, the air was mild enough that Beret Haugen sent her children to school without heavy wraps. The sun showed through haze. Wagon drivers moved without gloves. The temperature sat near 30 degrees, and the world felt like a promise. By noon, the promise was broken. The wind came first, not a gust, not a shift. A wall of moving air that hit the south side of the cabin hard enough to push the door inward against its latch. Marit was standing at the stove heating water for Eli's broth when the door rattled and the chimney draft reversed and blew ash into the room. She went to the window. The sky to the northwest had turned the color of iron, not gray, not black, but but the flat metallic tone of something forged. Snow was already falling, not from above but sideways, driven horizontal by a wind that had no interest in stopping. The temperature dropped, not gradually. Marit felt it in the walls. The chinking on the north side, which had been adequate in December, began to whistle. The water she had set to heat was still lukewarm by the time the outside air had gone from mild to bitter. Eli said, "Where is Tolef?" Marit's heart stopped and restarted in the space of a single breath. Tolef was at Beret Haugen's cabin. He had walked there after breakfast to help Beret's children bring in kindling from the pile. Beret's cabin was 3/4 of a mile east, 3/4 of a mile across open ground that was now invisible behind a curtain of driven snow. Marit went to the door and opened it. The wind took the door out of her hand and slammed it against the wall. Snow poured in, fine, dry, crystalline snow that cut skin and filled eyes and coated the threshold in 2 inches within seconds. The yard was gone. The woodpile was gone. The grade, the ruts, the fence posts, everything beyond 10 feet had vanished into white. She pulled the door shut. She leaned against it with both hands and felt the cold pushing through the boards as though the wood were paper. Eli said, "You cannot go." Marit said, "Tolef is out there." Eli said, "If you go out there, you die before you reach the fence line, and Tolef loses his mother the same winter he lost his father." Marit pressed her forehead against the door. The wood was already cold enough to sting. She could hear the wind tearing at the south wall boards, finding every gap, every looseness, every place where Oddmund's patching had been good enough for autumn, but was not good enough for this. She had to trust Beret. Beret had 4 children and a plank floor and 4 cords of wood. Beret would keep Tolef inside. Beret was practical and careful and would not let a boy walk into a storm that had erased the world. Marit turned away from the door. She fed the stove. She stuffed cloth into the gap under the south door. She moved Eli's blankets away from the east wall where the chinking was whistling. Then she checked the floor. The sand near the doorway was wet from the snow that had blown in during the 10 seconds the door was open. She scraped the wet sand away with a flat board and replaced it with dry sand from a flour barrel she had filled for exactly this purpose. The bark beneath the wet spot was intact. The seam held. The pitch had not cracked. Underneath, dry. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was an island. Snow piled against the north and west walls, to a depth that Marit could not see because the window was buried. The south door was drifted shut from outside. The east wall whistled continuously, a high, thin sound like a kettle that would not stop. The temperature inside the cabin, which Marit could judge only by the behavior of water near the walls, had dropped to the point where breath was visible, and the water bucket near the door was skimming with ice. Marit burned wood at a rate she could not sustain, 1 log every 40 minutes. The stove consumed fuel and returned heat that the walls gave away and the roof bled upward. But the floor held its line. The sand was dry. The bark beneath was dry. The ground beneath the bark was sealed away, and the moisture in the frozen earth stayed in the frozen earth instead of climbing into the cabin. The difference was not dramatic, it was steady. In every other winter Marit had experienced in Dakota Territory, the floor of a cabin was the coldest surface in the room. Cold radiated upward from frozen ground and created a layer of frigid air that clung to ankles and seeped into bedding and made children curl into the tightest shapes their bodies could manage. Heat rose, cold sank. The floor always lost. This floor did not lose. It was not warm. Nothing was warm, but it was dry, and dry cold was a different enemy than wet cold. Dry cold could be fought with blankets and a stove. Wet cold stole heat at a rate that no stove could match because it attacked through conduction, through direct contact between frozen damp earth and every surface that touched it. Marit knew the principle now. She had known it since her father poured water on bark in Telemark. But knowing it and feeling it were different things, and she felt it now with her whole body. She sat on the floor, on the sand, on the bark, on the sealed dirt, and the cold pressed up, but the wet did not follow, and the blanket she sat on stayed dry, and the air an inch above the floor was cold, but not bitter in the way that damp cold is bitter. 3 hours into the storm, someone banged on the east wall. Marit opened the door against the drift, shoveling snow inward to clear enough space. A man fell through the gap, not walked, fell, landing on the sand with snow packed into his beard and his coat frozen stiff at the shoulders. It was Thomas Falk, Pike's hired man, a 23-year-old who had been trying to reach the store barn when the wind had turned him around and pushed him sideways into Marit's fence line. Falk's boots were soaked through. His trousers were wet to the knee. Snow fell from his coat and his hat onto the sand in heavy clumps that began to melt immediately in the stove's heat. Nokomi's was already there. She had come to deliver a new pot of pitch mixture that morning, and the storm had caught her on the river path. She had reached Marit's cabin 20 minutes before the full whiteout because she had felt the wind shift and known what it meant. She was sitting near the stove with a blanket over her shoulders, quiet, watching. Nokomi said to Falk, "Take your boots off. Take your coat off. Do not carry wet across the floor." Falk looked at her. He looked at the floor. He said, "It's a dirt floor." Nokomi said, "It is not a dirt floor. Take your boots off or stand outside." Falk looked at Marit. Marit said, "She's right. Wet boots will foul the sand and break the seal. Take them off at the threshold." Falk peeled his boots off. His socks were soaked. Marit gave him dry cloth to wrap his feet and hung his boots near the stove, where they could dry without dripping onto the bark. The snow Falk had tracked in was already melting into the sand. Marit scraped the wet layer and replaced it again, working quickly with the flatboard and the dry sand from the flour barrel. She was burning through her sand reserve faster than she wanted. Nokomis watched her work. She said, "This is what I warned you. The floor holds from below. You must hold it from above." Night came, but the storm did not care about night. The wind shifted northwest and the cabin shook in its frame. A board on the south wall worked loose and began flapping, opening a gap 2 inches wide that let snow and cold pour through in a visible stream. Eli stuffed cloth into the gap, then her shawl, then a piece of bark that Marit cut from the reserve stack. The bark held against the wind better than the cloth because it was stiff and could be wedged into the opening. An hour later, another board loosened. Marit nailed it shut with the last 3 nails in the cabin. Falk helped. He was strong enough to hold the board flat while Marit drove the nails, and he did it without complaint, which meant he was either grateful or frightened or both. The stove ate wood. Marit counted the remaining logs by feel because the woodpile outside was buried and unreachable. 14 logs inside the cabin. At the current burn rate, 1 log every 35 to 40 minutes, 14 logs was between 8 and 9 hours of heat. If the storm lasted longer than that, the stove would go cold, and a cold stove in a buried cabin meant death. She rationed 1 log every 50 minutes instead of 40. The cabin grew colder. Breath hung in the air like cloth, but the floor held. Eli lay on the platform with 2 blankets and Tolef's coat draped over her legs. Nokomis sat near the stove with her back against the warm stones. Falk sat on the floor, on the sand, on the bark, and after an hour he said, "This floor is dry." Marit said, "Yes." Falk said, "Barrett Haugen's floor is dirt, same as every cabin on the low ground." Marit said nothing because the thought that followed was too heavy to speak aloud. If Barrett's floor was bare dirt, and the thaw had saturated the ground before the freeze hit, then Barrett's floor was now ice. Barrett's cabin was sitting on a frozen slab that would pull heat out of the room faster than Barrett could feed the stove, and Tolef was in that cabin. If you're invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next changes everything for both cabins. At some point during the night, the storm reached a pitch that Marit would remember for the rest of her life. The wind did not howl. Howling implies a voice, and a voice implies something alive. This wind was not alive. It was a mechanical force, a weight of moving air that pressed against the cabin walls with the patience of water filling a hole. The boards creaked. The roof poles groaned. Snow sifted through the chinking in threads so fine they looked like smoke. Marit checked the seams near the door, holding. She checked the seams near the stove. The heat had dried the nearest pitch line to the edge of cracking, and she warmed a knife blade at the stove and ran fresh pitch along the seam with her bare fingers because the rag was too clumsy for the job. The pitch burned her fingertips. She did not stop until the seam was sealed. 9 logs left. Nokomis said, "How long will the wood last?" Marit said, 6 hours. Nokomis said, "Is 6 hours enough?" Marit said, "I don't know." Nokomis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In my mother's time, people survived 3-day storms in birch bark lodges with no stove at all. The bark held the wind out. The people held each other's warmth in. A stove is better, but it is not the only thing." Marit understood what Nokomis was saying. If the wood ran out, the bark floor would still be there. The sealed cabin would still hold some heat. Bodies produce warmth. 4 people under blankets on a dry floor would survive longer than 4 people on a frozen slab. The margin might be small, but margins were what survival was made of. 2 hours before dawn, someone pounded on the door. Marit opened it into a wall of white. A shape pushed through. Berehaugen's eldest boy, Sigri's brother, 12 years old, with frost on his eyebrows and his lips the color of slate. He said, "My mother sent me. Ingeborg is turning blue. The floor is ice. Nothing works." Ingeborg was Beret's youngest, 3 years old. The boy had crossed 3/4 of a mile in the dark, in the worst blizzard to hit the Dakota Territory in a generation, because his mother had told him that Marit's cabin was different, and Ingeborg needed different. Marit looked at Nokomis. Nokomis was already standing. Marit said, "We need a rope." Falk said, "I have a halter line, 25 feet. Marit said, "It's not enough." Nokomis said, "Tie it to the door frame, walk the line out, plant a post, tie the rope to the post, walk 25 more feet, plant another post, keep going." Marit said, "I don't have posts." Nokomis said, "Use the axe handle, the shovel, the pallet frame, anything that stands upright in snow." Marit tied Falk's halter line to the door frame. She tied the other end around her own waist. She put on Oddman's coat and pulled her scarf over her face and went out into the storm. She could not stand. The wind knocked her sideways 2 steps for every step forward. The snow was not snow anymore. It was air that had been replaced with ice crystals, a suspension of frozen water so thick that breathing required turning away from the wind and pulling air through the scarf's weave. She crawled the last 10 feet to the fence post and tied the halter line there. Then she went back for more rope. They did not have more rope. Marit tore the pallet frame apart and used the longest board, 6 feet, as a bridge from the fence post into the dark. She crawled along it, drove Oddman's axe handle into the snow at the far end, and tied her scarf to it as a marker. The process was brutal and slow. 50 feet took 20 minutes. 100 feet took another 30. The wind did not relent. Marit's fingers stopped feeling and started burning, which she knew meant they were approaching frostbite. She went back inside, warmed them at the stove until the pain was blinding, and went out again. Falk went with her on the second stretch. He was bigger and heavier, and could push through drifts she could not. Together, they reached a fence line that Marit recognized as the boundary between her claim and Beret's grazing strip. They were halfway. It took another hour to reach Beret's door. When they arrived, the snow was drifted 5 feet up the walls, and the sound coming from inside was the stove roaring at full draw and a child crying in a thin, high voice that carried even through the wind. Marit pounded on the door. Beret opened it. The air that came out of Beret's cabin was warm from the stove, but wet in a way that Marit felt on her face like a slap. The damp was thick enough to taste. Beret's floor was frozen solid. The dirt that had soaked during the thaw had turned to a slab of ice that gleamed in the stove light. The stove was burning at a rate that would exhaust Beret's remaining wood in hours. The heat went up. The cold came from below. The children huddled on the sleeping platform, with their feet pulled off the floor because touching the floor was like touching a river in January. Tollef was there. He was sitting on the platform with his arms around his knees and his eyes wide, and his one remaining mitten still on his left hand. When he saw Marit, he said, "Mama," and did not say anything else, but the sound of it was enough to break something in Marit's chest that she could not afford to let break, so she swallowed it and kept moving. Beret said, "Ingeborg won't stop shaking." Marit found the child wrapped in every blanket Beret owned, lying on the platform, with her face the color of candle wax and her lips dark, and her small body trembling in continuous mechanical shivers. Marit picked her up. The child weighed nothing. 25 pounds, maybe less. Her skin was cold everywhere Marit touched. Marit said, "We're going to my cabin." Beret said, "In this?" Marit said, "Your floor is a slab of ice. Your stove is burning everything you have, and the heat is vanishing through the ground. My floor is dry. Ingeborg needs dry and warm, not just warm." Beret looked at her floor. She looked at the ice. She looked at the stove consuming her winter's wood and returning nothing that could reach the ground. She looked at her daughter, trembling in Marit's arms. Beret said, "Tell me the rope holds." Marit said, "It holds." They went, all of them. Beret carried Ingeborg. Marit carried Beret's 3-year supply of flour, 8 pounds, because leaving food behind was something neither of them could afford. Falk carried 2 blankets and the youngest boy. Beret's older children held the rope and walked with their faces turned from the wind. The crossing took 40 minutes. They followed the rope, post by post, board by board, through snow that erased everything except the line in their hands. Twice, Beret's oldest boy slipped and had to be pulled upright. Once, the rope sagged where a post had shifted, and Marit had to wade through a drift to reset it while the wind tried to push her off her feet. They reached Marit's cabin. They came through the door. 8 people now: Marit, Eli, Nokomis, Falk, Beret, and Beret's 4 children, in a cabin built for 3. Beret stepped onto the floor. She felt the sand under her stocking feet. Dry. She felt the air, cold, yes, but dry cold, not the wet cold that had been stealing Ingeborg's heat for hours. Marit took Ingeborg and laid her on the sleeping platform, raised off the floor, wrapped in dry blankets. Dry blankets. Not the damp blankets from Beret's frozen cabin. Clean, dry wool that had been sitting in a sealed cabin with a sealed floor for weeks. Within an hour, Ingeborg's trembling slowed. Within 2 hours, she stopped shaking. She was not warm. No one was warm, but she was dry, and dry meant her body could hold its own heat instead of losing it to damp cloth and frozen ground. 7 logs left. 8 people. The storm's still screaming outside. Marit looked at the floor. She looked at the bark, hidden under sand, hidden under feet, hidden under all the scrambling, desperate work of staying alive. The floor held. The seams held. The pitch held. The principle held, stopped the wet, and the cold becomes survivable. Outside, the storm buried the town. Inside, on a floor that looked like dirt but refused to be dirt, 8 people sat together and waited for morning. Kittel Vangen died that night. He was 63, a bachelor who lived in a claim shanty half a mile north of Calder's fence line. He tried to walk to his barn to check on his mule and did not find the barn. They found his body the next afternoon, 40 feet from his own door, frozen in a posture that suggested he had been walking in the wrong direction when the cold took him. The storm lasted another full day after that, then broke on the morning of January 14th. The sky opened to a blue so clean it hurt to look at. The temperature sat at 27 degrees below zero. Snow lay in drifts that reached roof lines. Nothing moved on the roads for 3 more days. In Marit's cabin, 8 people survived on 7 logs, dry blankets, bark-sealed ground, and each other's warmth. In Buries' cabin, the stove had burned out 6 hours after they left. The floor was a solid sheet of ice by morning. The blankets they had left behind were frozen stiff. Marit looked at the contrast and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. The floor said it. The sky stayed clear for 6 days after the storm. The cold stayed brutal. 20 below at dawn, 12 below at noon, 25 below after dark. The kind of cold that cracked fence posts and split water barrels and made the air itself feel like something that could be broken. Marit's cabin held 8 people for 3 of those days before the roads opened enough for Birch to take her children home. During those 3 days, 8 bodies heated a space meant for 3, and the stove burned at a rate Marit could barely sustain, and the sand on the floor got tracked and fouled and replaced and tracked again. But the bark held. Every morning Marit checked the seams on her hands and knees, scraping sand aside, pressing her thumb along the pitch lines, looking for cracks or lifts, or any sign that the ground beneath was pushing moisture through. Every morning the bark was dry. Every morning the dirt beneath the bark was dry. On the second day, Birch's youngest, Ingeborg, sat up on the sleeping platform and asked for bread. Her lips were still pale but no longer dark. Her trembling had stopped 12 hours after arriving on the dry floor. Birch sat beside her daughter and said nothing for a long time, and when she finally spoke, she did not speak to Marit. She spoke to Eli. She said, "Your sister's floor saved my daughter's life." Eli said, "Tell her that." Birch said, "I will, when I can say it without crying." Rufus Calder arrived on the 4th day after the storm, when the roads were still drifted but passable on horseback. He came alone, without the clipboard, which meant this was not an official visit. He stomped snow from his boots at the threshold. He had heard about the boot rule, apparently, and stepped inside. Birch and her children had left the day before. The cabin held only Marit, Eli, Tolef, and the smell of too many people in too small a space for too many days. Nokomis had left at first light, walking the river path north with her basket and her oilcloth bundle, and a calmness that suggested blizzards were not new to her. Calder stood on the floor. He shifted his weight. He crouched. He did not press his palm to the sand this time. Instead, he pulled his belt knife and scraped the sand away from a section near the east wall, the dampest wall, the wall where moisture pressure from the frozen ground outside was strongest. He exposed the bark. He pressed his thumb against it. He lifted the edge and looked at the dirt beneath. The dirt was dry. He replaced the bark. He brushed the sand back into place. He stood. He said, "I went to Birch Haugen's cabin this morning. Marit waited. Calder said, I took a hatchet. I chipped frozen mud from her floor for 15 minutes and did not reach dry dirt. The frost goes down 8 inches. Her stove burned out the night she left. Everything below knee height in that cabin is frozen solid. The blankets she left behind shattered when I picked them up. He paused. He looked at the floor beneath his feet. He said, Then I came here. The dirt under your bark is dry. The sand is dry. The bedding is dry. You burned, what, half a cord during the storm? Marit said, Less than half. Calder said, Bray burned nearly all of hers trying to heat damp air above a frozen slab. She'll need to borrow 2 cords to finish the winter, and 2 cords is $20 no one on this line has. He was quiet for a moment. Calder was a man who measured things. He measured roads and grades and bridge timbers and the distance between fence posts. He measured problems and solutions and the gap between what people claimed and what the numbers showed. He was measuring now. He said, I told you 6 cords and planks. I told you to sell the cow and take rooms in town. I told you the floor was the problem, and I was right about that. But I told you the solution was raised planks and stone footings and a man's labor for 8 days. He looked at Marit. He said, You found the part I missed. Marit said, The part was not mine. The part was Nokomis's, and before that, my father's. And before that, whoever taught the bark what it knows. Calder said, I don't care whose part it was. It works. I measured Beret's floor, and I measured yours, and the numbers don't argue. He put his knife back in his belt. He pulled his hat on. At the door, he said, I'll be sending people to you. Women, mostly. They'll want to know how. Marit said, Send them. They came within the week. Not in a group because frontier women did not move in groups. They came one at a time, walking the frozen roads with their scarves pulled tight, carrying questions the way they carried flour sacks, carefully because the contents mattered. The first was a woman named Christy Lunde, who lived 2 miles south and had lost half her stored flour to damp during the storm. Her cabin had a plank floor, but the planks sat directly on the dirt without any barrier, and moisture had wicked upward through the wood and into the flour sacks stacked against the wall. She wanted to know whether bark could be laid beneath existing planks. Marit said yes if the planks could be lifted. She described the method: bark on dirt, shingle overlaps, pitch tallow ash seams, planks replaced on top. The bark did not need to be visible. It needed to be continuous. The second was a woman named Barbro Tveit, whose husband had refused to believe that a dirt floor was killing their stove's efficiency until the blizzard proved it. Barbro's husband was not there. Barbro had come alone, which told Marit everything about the dynamics in that cabin. Barbro asked how wide the overlaps should be, whether bark could be patched if a section tore, whether stove sparks would burn through the sand, and whether mice would nest beneath the bark. Marit answered each question from experience. 4 inches minimum on overlaps, more near doors and walls. Patches could be laid over tiers and sealed with fresh pitch. Sand at 1 inch depth absorbed sparks before they reached the bark. She had tested this by dropping a live ember onto the sand and watching it die without reaching the surface below. Mice were a concern. She had not yet seen evidence of nesting, but Nokomis had suggested laying a border of ash along the walls where mice might try to burrow, because mice disliked the alkaline taste. The third visitor was not a woman. It was Berit Haugen, carrying a sack of sand and a look on her face that Marit recognized because she had worn it herself on the day Calder told her the numbers did not add up. Berit set the sand by the door. She said, I need to learn the floor. Marit said, I know. Berit said, I told you bark was for canoes and kindling. I told you that you were wasting days. Marit said, You were not wrong about the risk. You were wrong about the idea. Birch said, the difference nearly killed Ingeborg. Marit could have let that statement carry all the weight Birch intended. She could have let Birch sit with the guilt of having doubted. Instead, she said, you sent Sigri with sand before the storm, before you believed. You sent sand because you did not want the children to freeze, even if you thought the method was foolish. That is not the same as being wrong. Birch looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, show me the seams. Marit showed her. They spent the afternoon on their knees in Marit's cabin, Marit demonstrating the shingle overlap, the pitch application, the sand coverage, while Birch asked the kind of precise, practical questions that Marit had come to expect from a woman who managed 4 children and a claim on arithmetic alone. How many sheets per square foot? How much pitch per seam? How long before the pitch needed reapplication? What to do if the sand got wet from above? By the time Birch left, she had a bundle of bark sheets under her arm, a small pot of pitch mixture in her coat pocket, and a list of instructions written in Marit's careful hand on the back of a flour sack. Pike resisted. He heard about Calder's visit. He heard about the women coming to Marit's cabin. He heard specifically that Calder had said Marit found the part I missed, which for a man who controlled the supply line to every cabin in the valley was not a compliment to Marit, but a threat to his leverage. Pike's business depended on need. He sold flour, nails, lamp oil, and credit. Credit was the most profitable because it came with interest, and when the debtor failed, with land. A woman who could teach other women how to survive winter with less fuel, less lumber, and less money was a woman who reduced the valley's need for Pike's credit. Every cabin with a bark floor was a cabin that burned less wood, stored drier flour, and owed Pike fewer dollars in spring. He came to the store counter conversation the way he came to everything, sideways. He told men who lingered near the stove that Marit's cabin had survived because she had better walls than most, not because of the floor. He said the bark was a novelty that would rot by spring. He said Birch's cabin had frozen because Birch's husband had not chinked properly, not because the dirt floor was wet. His hired man, Thomas Falk, was standing in the store when Pike said this. Falk did not speak immediately. He waited until Pike had finished, and 2 other men had nodded. Then Falk said quietly, I slept on that floor during the storm. My boots were soaked when I came in. The woman and the old Indian made me take them off at the door. I slept on dry ground all night while the storm buried the cabin. When I woke up, the sand was dry, and the bark was dry, and my back was not frozen to the ground. Pike looked at Falk. Falk looked at the floor of Pike's store, which was plank and dry, and built at the cost of $47 in lumber that Falk knew about because he had carried it. Falk said, the widow's floor cost her nothing but labor and bark. It held the same as your planks, maybe better because her cabin sits lower than yours and the water table is higher. Pike said, that's enough, Thomas. Falk said, yes, sir. The conversation moved on, but the words stayed in the room the way Pike's mockery had stayed in the room 2 months earlier. Marit was papering the dirt like it was a parlor wall. Falk slept on that floor and woke up dry. The 2 statements sat beside each other in the valley's memory, and the valley was beginning to decide which one it believed. Nokomis came back in late January after the deep cold had settled into a routine of 15 to 25 below at night and 5 to 10 below during the day. She brought something Marit had not seen before, a roll of bark harvested not from deadfall, but from a living tree, taken carefully in a way that left the tree wounded but alive. The bark was thicker, more pliable, and had a reddish inner surface that smelled like green wood. Marit said, you took this from a living tree. Nokomis said, I took what the tree could give. There is a difference between taking and stealing. If you cut too deep or too wide, the tree dies. If you cut correctly, the tree heals and grows new bark over the wound. She showed Marit the cutting marks on the harvested sheet. A vertical cut, shallow, following the grain. A horizontal cut at top and bottom, also shallow. The bark had been peeled away gently, leaving the inner cambium layer intact on the tree. She said the tree would cover the wound with new growth in 2 or 3 seasons. Marit said, I have been using only deadfall. Nokomi said, Deadfall is good for now, but the deadfall along the river will not last if 20 cabins start using bark floors. You need to learn how to harvest from living trees without killing them. Otherwise, you are solving one problem by creating another. They spent 2 days together, not working on the floor was done. Working on knowledge. Nokomis taught Marit which trees could be harvested, and which were too young or too stressed. She taught her the season for harvesting, late spring, when the sap was running, and the bark separated more easily. She taught her the signs of a tree that was already weakened by disease or insects, and should not be cut. On the second evening, sitting near the stove while Tolef slept, and Eli read by lamplight, Nokomis told Marit about the canoe-building camps she had known as a girl. Families would gather near the birch groves in early summer. The men would select trees, the women would harvest bark. The entire community would build canoes together, and the knowledge passed from grandmother to granddaughter through hands, not words. Nokomis said, The French called us savages and then bought our canoes because their boats could not run the rivers. The settlers call this bark trickery and then come to you for lessons because their floors are ice. The pattern does not change. The people who know the bark are dismissed until the people who dismiss them need what the bark can do. Marit said, I will not let that happen here. Nokomis said, You cannot stop it. What you can do is teach the whole method, not just the laying and the sealing, the harvesting, the respect, where the bark comes from and what it costs the tree. If people learn only the technique, they will strip every birch along the Cheyenne and call it progress. Marit said, I understand. Nokomis said, You understand with your mind. Marit said, You said that before, about my hands. Nokomis smiled. It was the first time Marit had seen her smile. She said, Your hands learned faster than most. Your mind will catch up. The partnership between them deepened through February and into March. Nokomis brought bark knowledge, harvesting, preparation, the behavior of bark in cold, in heat, in damp, in dry air. Marit brought what Nokomis called measuring eyes, the ability to calculate square footage, estimate material needs, plan seam layouts for cabins of different sizes, and keep records of what worked and what failed. Together they visited Beret Haugen's cabin and supervised the laying of Beret's bark floor. Beret's husband, a quiet man named Lars who had said nothing about the floor during the blizzard and nothing after, stood in the doorway and watched 2 women and an Ojibwe elder lay bark on his dirt floor and seal it with pitch that smelled like the forest he had been too proud to learn from. Nokomis taught Beret's children to test bark scraps by dripping water and watching it bead. The 3-year-old Ingeborg sat on the new bark floor and pressed her palm against it and said, dry. It was the only word she contributed to the process, and it was the only word needed. There was a moment during the laying of Beret's floor when Nokomis and Marit disagreed. Marit wanted to extend the bark up the walls by 3 inches to create a continuous seal between floor and wall base. Nokomis said the wall base needed to breathe. Trapping moisture between bark and wood would rot the logs faster than leaving them exposed. Marit said, but the moisture comes in at the wall base. That's where the frost climbs. Nokomis said, the frost climbs because the ground is wet. You have stopped the ground from being wet inside. The wall base will dry on its own now that the floor is not feeding moisture into the air. Marit was not convinced. Nokomis said, lay it your way on the east wall. Lay it my way on the west wall. We will check in April and the walls will tell us who was right. Marit agreed. By April, the east wall base, sealed with bark, showed the beginnings of soft rot where moisture had been trapped between bark and log. The west wall base, left exposed, was dry. Nokomis did not say she had been right. She simply touched the soft rot and looked at Marit, and Marit pulled the bark from the east wall without being told. It was the kind of teaching that could not be done in words. It required time, a mistake, and the patience to let the mistake speak for itself. Nokomis left in late March. She had been coughing since February, not the rattle of Eli's winter cough, but a deeper sound, wet and heavy, that came from a place in her chest that did not want to clear. She said nothing about it for weeks. Marit heard it at night when they sat near the stove, and Nokomis sorted bark strips, or mended a basket, or simply sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the fire. One evening, Marit said, "The cough is getting worse." Nokomis said, "The cough has been with me for 2 winters. It will be with me until it is done." Marit said, "There is a doctor in the rail town." Nokomis said, "The doctor in the rail town will tell me what I already know." She did not say what she knew. Marit did not ask because the answer was in the sound of the cough, and the sound was clear enough. Nokomis chose to travel north to relatives near White Earth before the spring mud made the roads impassable. She packed her oilcloth bundle, her basket, and her tools. She left 3 things with Marit: the clay pot of pitch mixture, a bundle of prepared bark sheets sufficient for 1 more cabin floor, and the crooked seam knife she had carried for 30 years. Marit held the knife. It was bone-handled, with a blade that curved slightly to the left, a flaw in the steel that Nokomis had turned into a feature, using the curve to follow bark seams the way water follows a slope. Nokomis said, "Do not teach the bark without teaching the tree." Marit said, "I won't." Nokomis said, "The settlers will want the technique. They will not want the knowledge. The technique without the knowledge is theft. Do you understand?" Marit said, "I understand." Nokomis looked at her for a long time. Then she put her hand on Marit's shoulder, the first time she had touched Marit since the day she corrected her bark cutting at the river, and said, "You are a good student, but you are a better teacher. I saw that before you did." She walked down the grade toward the river path without looking back. Marit stood in the doorway and watched until the small figure disappeared around the bend where the willows grew thick, and then she stood there longer, because the doorway felt like the right place to be when someone you had come to depend on walked out of your life and into a distance you could not follow. The cabin was quiet that evening. Tolif asked where Nokomis had gone. Marit said she had gone to her family. Tolif asked if she was coming back. Marit said she did not think so. She hung the crooked seam knife on a nail above the stove, wrapped in a piece of cloth to protect the edge, and she left it there. The secondary crisis came in November of 1888, 10 months after the blizzard. The schoolhouse sat on low ground 1/2 mile from the general store, a single-room building with a plank floor that had been laid directly on dirt without any barrier. 31 children attended, ranging from 6 years old to 14. The teacher, a woman named Marthe Espeland, kept the stove burning from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and still the children sat with their feet on a floor that was, by November, damp enough to darken the wood and cold enough to numb toes through boot leather. A wet freeze in early November turned the ground beneath the schoolhouse into the same frozen slab that had nearly killed Ingeborg Haugen. The plank floor, which had been adequate in dry years, could not stop moisture from wicking upward through the wood. The children's boots froze to the floorboards during lessons. Marthe Espeland kept a bucket of warm water near the stove so children could thaw their boots at midday, which meant she was pouring water onto a floor that was already too wet, which made the problem worse. Calder came to Marit. He arrived without ceremony, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hand, which Marit had never seen before and which told her something was wrong. He said, "The schoolhouse floor is killing my stove budget. I'm burning 3 cords a month, heating a room where the floor is a block of ice. The children are getting sick. Marty tells me 2 have stopped coming because their mothers won't send them to sit on a frozen floor for 6 hours. Marit said, "You want me to inspect the building?" Calder said, "I want you to fix the building." Marit said, "Fix it how?" Calder said, "The way you fix this." He gestured at her floor. Bark under the planks, pitch on the seams. Whatever you did here, do it there. Marit said, "The schoolhouse is larger than my cabin. The floor is plank, not dirt. The planks will need to be lifted, the dirt prepared, the bark laid, and the planks replaced. That is a full day's work for 6 people." Calder said, "I can get 6 people." Marit said, "I'll need bark. I have some in reserve, but not enough for the full floor. We can do the children's side, the half of the room where the benches are, and leave the teacher's side and the stove area for later." Calder said, "How much pitch?" Marit said, 2 pots. I have one. I'll need tallow and ash for the second." Calder said, "I'll get it." Marit said, "And I'll need sand. Dry sand. Enough to cover the barked section to 1 inch." Calder said, "Done." This was the moment Marit realized that her position in the valley had changed. 5 months earlier, Calder had told her to sell the cow and take rooms in town. Now he was standing in her doorway asking her to solve a problem that affected every family in the settlement. The shift was not about respect exactly. It was about knowledge. She knew something no one else knew, and the children were cold, and knowledge that keeps children warm becomes authority whether anyone grants it or not. She organized the work party for a Saturday night, when the schoolhouse would be empty until Monday morning. 6 adults volunteered: Beret Haugen, Beret's husband Lars, Christy Lund, Christy's brother, Calder himself, and Thomas Falk, who had not been asked but who arrived at dusk with a spade and a lantern, and said nothing about why he had come. They lifted the plank floor on the children's side. The dirt beneath was black with moisture, frozen in a crust that cracked under the spade. They scraped the ice, leveled the dirt, and let it dry for 2 hours near the stove, while Marit laid bark sheets and beret-sealed seams. Marit taught as she worked. She showed Christy how to overlap like shingles. She showed Lars how to warm bark near the stove before laying it flat. She showed Falk how to mix pitch, tallow, and ash in the right proportions. She corrected Calder's seam work twice. He was pressing too hard and squeezing the pitch out instead of spreading it, and Calder accepted the correction the way he accepted measurements from a surveyor, with the understanding that someone who knows more is not someone who knows better, just someone who knows differently. They replaced the planks at 2 in the morning. They covered the floor with sand, swept it level, and opened the doors to let the stove heat the room for the remaining hours before dawn. Pike was not there. Pike had been asked to donate pitch. The general store had pine pitch in stock, and he had refused. Calder had responded by buying the pitch on credit and telling Pike to write his name correctly in the ledger, which was a public humiliation so quiet that only the men present understood its weight. If this story reminds you why preparation matters and why the people who prepare are often the ones dismissed, share it with someone who needs to hear it. On Monday morning, 31 children walked into the schoolhouse and sat on benches placed over a floor that had been sealed against the frozen ground beneath it. Marte Espelon noticed first. She said, "The floor is different." It was not warm. The schoolhouse was still a single-room building with thin walls and a stove that worked too hard, but the planks were dry. The boots did not freeze to the wood. The bucket of warm water sat unused beside the stove. 2 children who had stopped coming returned that week because their mothers had heard about the floor. The success was modest. Marit said so herself when Calder asked for a report. She said, "The children's side is drier. The teacher's side is not. The stove still works too hard because the walls are thin. The bark helps, but it does not solve everything." Calder said, "It solves the part that was making children sick." Marit said, "It solves the floor. The walls are your problem." Calder almost smiled. He said, "Fair enough." The schoolhouse floor was the moment the method stopped belonging to Marit alone. It was no longer a widow's strange experiment on a lowland claim. It was a community tool applied to a public building by 6 people who had learned it, using bark that had been harvested respectfully, sealed with pitch that had been mixed from a recipe carried by an Ojibwe woman who was now somewhere north of the valley, coughing into the wind. Marit stood in the schoolhouse after the children had gone home and looked at the floor. She could not see the bark. It was hidden beneath planks, hidden beneath sand, hidden beneath the ordinary appearance of a floor that did what floors were supposed to do. No one who walked on it would know what lay beneath unless they were told. She thought about Nokomi's saying, "Do not teach the bark without teaching the tree." She had taught the bark. 6 people now knew how to lay it, seal it, and maintain it. But how many of them knew where the knowledge came from? How many of them would remember that the shingle overlap was canoe logic, that the pitch mixture was Ojibwe craft, that the harvesting method was designed to leave the tree alive? She did not have an answer. She only had the question, and the question sat inside her the way the damp had once sat in the dirt floor, quietly, persistently, refusing to evaporate on its own. She locked the schoolhouse door and walked home in the dark. The crooked seam knife hung above her stove. Tolliff was asleep. Eli was reading by lamplight, her cough reduced to a whisper. The floor beneath Marit's feet was dry, and the ground beneath the floor was sealed away, and the cabin that everyone had told her to abandon was still standing, still warm, still hers. Outside, the wind turned north, and winter pressed its hands against the walls, and the walls held. Winter settled into the valley the way debt settles into a ledger, slowly, then all at once, then as though it had always been there. By December of 1888, Marit Brecka had laid or supervised the laying of bark floors in 7 cabins besides her own. She had taught 14 people the method. She had used Nokomis' pitch recipe so many times that the proportions lived in her hands the way a hymn lives in a throat. Without thinking, without measuring, just the right amount of pitch softened first, then tallow stirred in, then ash folded through until the shine went dull and the mixture gripped like mud. The cabins that used her method burned less wood. The difference was measurable because frontier women measured everything that kept children alive. Christy Lund reported that her family had used 4 cords through the previous winter without the bark floor. This winter, with bark beneath the planks, they were on pace for 3. Beret Haugen, whose cabin had nearly killed Ingeborg the year before, reported dry bedding for the first time in 3 winters and a stove that held temperature through the night instead of losing it to the ground by midnight. The numbers spread the way numbers do on a claim line, through women talking at the well, through men comparing wood piles, through children who came home from school and told their parents that the schoolhouse floor no longer froze their boots. The method was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply worked quietly, beneath sand and planks, and the ordinary traffic of living, and the people who used it knew the difference the way they knew the difference between a dry blanket and a wet one. Marit did not charge for her work. She refused payment from families with sick children or insufficient fuel. From families who had surplus, she accepted labor, sand, pitch materials, or help with her own woodpile. One man brought her a crosscut saw, which was worth more than money because it meant she could fell and buck her own timber without borrowing tools. Another brought 3 pounds of rendered tallow, enough for 6 pots of pitch mixture. She corrected people who called it a trick. She corrected people who called it clever. She said, "It is not a trick, it is a barrier. The bark stops moisture, the pitch seals the seams. The sand protects the surface." That is not cleverness. That is understanding what the ground does to a cabin and stopping it. She also corrected people who credited her alone. When a man at Calder's barn raising said Marit Brecka had invented the bark floor, Marit said, "I did not invent it. My father showed me the principle in Norway. Nokomis Beneshi showed me the technique here. The bark itself taught both of them. I am the student, not the source." Some people heard this. Some people did not. The valley began calling it Brika lining, which Marit disliked but could not stop, the way you cannot stop a river from finding its own name for the channel it cuts. Jonas Pike's resolution came in January of 1889, exactly 1 year after the blizzard, and it came not through confrontation but through the same force that had nearly broken Marit: water in the wrong place. A thaw in the second week of January, milder than the one that preceded the blizzard but following the same pattern, sent meltwater running through the low ground behind Pike's general store. The storage room that held Pike's flour, salt, sugar, and dry goods sat on a plank floor with no barrier beneath it. The planks had been adequate for 8 years because the storage room sat on higher ground than most cabins, and Pike had never experienced the kind of moisture intrusion that plagued the lowland claims. This January was different. The thaw was deeper. The snowpack was heavier. The meltwater found a channel beneath the store's foundation that had not existed before, a depression left by a rotted root, and water seeped upward through the dirt, through the planks, and into the bottom of every flour sack stacked against the south wall. Pike discovered the damage on a Tuesday morning when a customer complained that the flour she had purchased the day before smelled of mildew. Pike checked the storage room and found 17 sacks of flour, each weighing 25 pounds, sitting in a ring of dark moisture that had wickered 6 inches up the cloth. The flour was not ruined entirely, but the bottom 3 inches of each sack was caked and sour and unsellable. 17 sacks at 55 cents each. $9.35 of inventory lost to the same problem that had frozen Barre Hogan's floor, that had killed Kittel Vangen's mule when the barn floor iced over, that had sent 2 children home from school because the planks froze their boots. Pike said nothing publicly. He moved the surviving flour to higher shelves. He dried the planks near the stove. He told customers the flour was fine. But the following week, a second thaw sent more water through the same channel, and this time the damage reached the salt stores. Salt that absorbed moisture was salt that clumped and could not be measured accurately, and Pike's customers noticed when their half-pound purchases weighed light. 3 women returned salt to the counter on the same morning. Pike refunded them, which cost him another $1.20. His face, when the third woman set the clumped salt on the counter and asked for her money, was the face of a man watching his own floor betray him. Marit heard about the salt from Buries. She did not go to Pike's store. She did not offer help. She did not mention the floor. She went about her work, harvesting bark for a cabin 2 miles south, mixing pitch in her kitchen, teaching Buries' eldest daughter how to check seams for cracks, and waited. Pike came to her. He came on a Thursday afternoon, driving his buckboard with the name Pike General's Supply painted on the side. The same buckboard he had driven to her cabin 14 months earlier with a sack of flour that was not a gift. He stood in her doorway and did not come inside. He said, "I need the floor lined." Marit said, "Which floor?" Pike said, "The storage room." Marit said, "The storage room where you keep the flour and salt that you sell to people on credit." Pike's jaw worked. He said, "Yes." Marit said, "I'll need to see the room." Pike said, "When?" Marit said, "Now." They drove to the store in Pike's buckboard without speaking. Marit inspected the storage room. The damage was visible: water stains on the planks, dark rings on the wall base where moisture had climbed, the smell of mildew beneath the stronger smells of salt and coffee and kerosene. She lifted a plank and looked at the dirt beneath. Wet. A dark, heavy wet that would freeze within weeks and turn the storage room into the same icebox that had nearly killed Ingeborg Haugen. Marit replaced the plank. She stood and faced Pike. She said, "I can line this floor. It will take a day. I'll need bark, pitch, and help lifting the planks." Pike said, "How much?" Marit said, "I don't charge money, but I have a condition." Pike waited. Marit said, "Clear Barre Haugen's account. She owes you $11 from last winter's flour and lamp oil. Clear it." Pike said, "That's $11. Marit said, "Your flour loss is already more than that. Your salt loss adds to it. Next month, when the deep freeze comes, you'll lose everything in this room if the floor stays wet. $11 against that is cheap. Pike said, and my own account? The $31 your husband owed? Marit said, I'll pay that in spring, as I said I would. This is not about my debt. This is about berets. Pike looked at the wet floor. He looked at the flour on the high shelves where he had moved it, temporary and precarious. He looked at the woman standing in his storage room offering to solve his problem for the price of someone else's freedom. He said, Fine. Beret's account is cleared. Marit said, And you will not extend predatory credit on winter supplies to any family that asks for bark floor instruction. If someone comes to you for flour and they mention the floor, you will sell them flour at the posted price without adding interest for late winter. Pike said, That is not your business. Marit said, Every cabin I line reduces your credit leverage. You know that. I know that. We can pretend otherwise, or we can agree that a valley full of dry cabins is a valley full of people who can pay their bills in spring instead of defaulting in March. Pike was quiet for a long time. He was calculating. Marit could see it in his eyes, the same arithmetic she had done on the back of the deed paper the day she arrived, except Pike's numbers were larger and his losses were fresh. He said, Clear Beret's account. Posted prices without winter interest. You line my floor and you teach my wife how to maintain the seams. Marit said, I'll teach your wife. I'll teach anyone who asks. Pike said, Show me the seams. It was the same phrase Beret had used. Show me the seams. 3 words that meant, I was wrong, and I need what you know, and I cannot say either of those things directly, so I will say this instead. Marit showed him the seams. She lined Pike's storage room floor in a single day with help from Falk and Beret's husband, Lars. She laid the bark with extra care at the south wall where the moisture channel ran, using double layers with staggered seams, the way she had sealed her own threshold. She sealed everything with pitch tallow ash and covered it with sand and replaced the planks. Pike's wife, a thin woman named Alma who had never spoken to Marit before, watched the entire process and asked questions that were sharper than her husband's. How long before the pitch needs resealing? What happens if a barrel leaks onto the planks? Whether rats will chew through the bark? Marit answered every question and wrote the maintenance schedule on a piece of cardstock that Alma pinned to the storage room wall. Pike did not thank Marit. He did not say she had been right. He did not apologize for 14 months of mockery, debt pressure, and the phrase that had followed her through the valley like a second shadow. He simply paid. He cleared Beret's account that afternoon. He posted flour prices without winter interest the following week, and when a customer asked him about the bark floor, he said, Ask the Breccia woman, she knows. It was not conversion. It was capitulation, and Marit accepted it the way she accepted everything Pike gave carefully, knowing that what was offered was less than what was owed, but enough to keep moving forward. Bjarne Solheim arrived in the valley in March of 1889, a widowed carpenter of 32, with 1 daughter, a girl of 9 named Ragna, who had her mother's coloring and her father's quiet way of watching before speaking. He came because Calder had written to a cousin in Minnesota, asking whether any carpenter was willing to relocate for steady work, and Calder's cousin knew Arne, whose wife had died of typhoid the previous spring and who needed distance from the house where she had died. Arne's first job was building raised plank frames for 3 cabins that wanted bark floors beneath proper flooring. The design was Marit's: bark on prepared dirt, sealed with pitch, then a frame of joists set on log rounds, then planks laid across the joists. The bark stopped moisture from below. The raised planks created an air gap between bark and living surface. The combination was better than either element alone. Marit met Arne at the first cabin. She was laying bark when he arrived with a wagon of milled lumber and a tool chest that he carried with 1 arm, which told her something about his strength and something about how he thought about his tools. She said, The joists need to sit on the log rounds, not on the bark. If the joists press directly on the bark, they'll crush the seams. Arne looked at the bark floor. He looked at the seams. He crouched and pressed his thumb along a pitch line, the way Nokomi's had done, the way Calder had done, the way everyone who encountered the floor for the first time seemed compelled to do, as though the only way to believe it was to touch it. He said, "Who designed this?" Marit said, "I laid it. An Ojibwe woman named Nokomis Bineshi taught me the technique. My father showed me the principle." Arne said, "The seam work is good." Marit said, "The seam work is the only part that matters." He looked at her. She looked at him. It was not a romantic moment. It was the moment when two people who are good at making things recognize each other's competence, the way two musicians recognize each other when they hear the first three notes. Arne said, "I'll set the joists on the log rounds and leave a half-inch of clearance above the bark." Marit said, "A full inch. The bark needs air above it to shed any moisture that gets past the sand." Arne said, "A full inch, then." They worked together that day and the next. Arne built the frame. Marit sealed the bark. They argued about the joist height twice. Arne wanted the floor lower for headroom. Marit wanted it higher for airflow, and settled on a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely, which Marit later realized was the foundation of every partnership that lasts. Ragna sat on the finished floor that evening and said, "It smells like trees." Marit said, "It is trees, just arranged differently." The partnership grew through the spring and summer of 1889. Arne built frames. Marit laid bark. They traveled together to cabins that needed work, sometimes taking Tolef and Rana, who became companions in the way that children of working parents become companions, through proximity, shared boredom, and the slow discovery that the other person is worth knowing. Marit taught Arne to mix pitch. Arne taught Marit to set joists plumb. They disagreed about planking thickness, about sand depth, about whether ash should be mixed into the sand as well as the pitch. These disagreements were not fights. They were the conversations of two people building something together who had different ideas about how the something should be built, and who respected each other enough to argue openly instead of conceding silently. The romance, when it came through labor. Marit noticed Arne's hands first, large, scarred, careful with tools and careful with children, the hands of a man who had learned that gentleness was not weakness, but precision. Arne noticed Marit's stubbornness first, the way she refused to compromise on seam quality even when time was short, the way she checked every pitch line twice, the way she stood in a finished cabin and looked at the floor with an expression that was not satisfaction but something closer to vigilance, as though the floor had earned her trust but not her complacency. They married in the spring of 1892 in a ceremony at the schoolhouse whose floor they had both helped to build. Calder attended. Beret attended with all 4 children, including Ingeborg, now 7 years old and loud and healthy, and unaware that she had nearly died on a frozen floor 3 winters earlier. Pike did not attend, but Alma Pike sent a length of cotton fabric that Marit used to make a dress for Ragna. The years compressed the way years do when work replaces crisis. Tolef grew from a silent boy into a capable young man who apprenticed with Arne and learned to build frames that sat over bark-lined floors. He combined the old method with newer materials as they became available. Tar paper arrived in the valley by 1893, and Tolef began using bark and tar paper together, the bark as the primary moisture barrier, and the tar paper as a secondary seal at wall junctures where bark alone was vulnerable. Eli's cough healed fully by the summer of 1889. She became a teacher, first at the schoolhouse and then at a second school built 3 miles east, and she kept the schoolhouse floor dry through 3 more winters, checking seams every October, and relaying sand every November with the help of her oldest students. Marit's reputation grew in the quiet way that practical reputations grow, not through praise or publication, but through results. By 1891, she was called before winter to inspect damp cabins, teach seam laying, and organize bark harvesting parties that followed the rules Nokomis had taught. Harvest from trees that could survive the cut, take only what the tree could give, and never strip more than a quarter of the circumference. She always corrected people who called it breccia lining. She always said, "The technique is Ojibwe. The knowledge is older than anyone in this valley. I learned it. I did not create it." Some people listened, some did not. The name persisted the way names persist when they are easier to say than the truth they replace. Marit stopped trying to control the name and started trying to control the knowledge. When she taught new families, she taught the tree first. She took them to the birch stand along the river and showed them which trees could be harvested and which could not. She showed them the scars on trees that had been cut properly and healed over, and the dead trunks of trees that had been stripped too aggressively and killed. She said, "The bark floor is not a product. It is a relationship between your cabin and the tree that gave it skin. If you take without understanding, you will run out of bark in 5 years and the method dies. If you take with respect, the trees will keep giving and the method lasts." Not everyone understood, but enough did. And the birch stand along the Cheyenne Bend, which Marit had found with 30 trees in the autumn of 1887, still held 27 living trees by the spring of 1893. 3 had been lost to storm damage, not to harvesting. Marit lived out her later years near the Cheyenne Bend, not on the lowest part of the claim anymore, but on higher ground where Arna had built a proper house, with a bark-lined foundation, raised plank floors, and walls thick enough to hold winter at arm's length. She could see the first cabin from her kitchen window, the 16 by 18-foot structure with 2 log walls and 2 patched board walls where she had laid 300 square feet of birch bark on a dirt floor with pitch-stained hands and a faith she could not justify to anyone who had not felt dry ground beneath their palm when every other floor in the valley was ice. The first cabin became a storage building, then a workshop. Then, after the roof finally sagged beyond repair in 1903, a ruin that Tollef's children played in without knowing what it had been. But the bark floor, sealed beneath sand and debris, lasted longer than the walls that had sheltered it. When Tollef cleared the site in 1907, he found bark sheets still intact beneath 20 years of accumulated dirt. The pitch had darkened and hardened, but had not cracked. The seams held. Marit kept Nokomis's crooked seam knife wrapped in cloth above the stove in every house she lived in. When younger settlers asked about it, she told them it belonged to the woman who taught her which side the water belonged on. Some of them understood what that meant. Some of them just saw an old knife and nodded politely. Marit did not mind the nodding. She minded only the forgetting, and the knife on the wall was her defense against it. She never learned what happened to Nokomis. Letters sent to White Earth were not returned, but they were not answered either. Marit chose to believe that Nokomis had reached her family and lived out her remaining years near people who did not need to be taught what bark could do because they had always known. Zio. Within 5 winters of the blizzard, more than 30 cabins in the valley used some form of bark or waterproof lining beneath sleeping areas, storage corners, or whole floors. Not every family copied Marit's full method. Some used plank floors over bark. Some used only patch sections beneath beds and flower stores. But the core lesson spread through the claim line like water through a proper channel, steadily, following the path of least resistance, arriving where it was needed. Stop the damp before you feed the stove. Calder, grown older and slower, but no less precise, refused to approve any new lowland claim cabin unless the owner could explain where ground moisture would go. He told them to come see Marit if they did not know the answer. Most of them did. A few did not, and Calder did not approve their cabins, and they learned the lesson the hard way in January, and then they came to see Marit too. Marit Brecca died in the winter of 1917 at the age of 59. In the house Arna had built on the high ground above the Cheyenne Bend. She died in her sleep, on a dry bed, on a floor that Tollef had lined with bark and tar paper the previous autumn. Arna had died 2 years earlier. Ragna, their daughter by partnership, if not by birth, kept the house. Tulliff kept the workshop. The crooked seam knife stayed on the wall. On the morning they found her, the temperature outside was 11 degrees below zero. The floor beneath her bed was dry. The blankets that covered her were dry. The stove had burned down to coals during the night, but the room had held its warmth because the ground beneath the house was sealed away, and the cold that pressed upward from the frozen earth could not reach the woman who had spent 30 years teaching her valley how to stop it. They called it brick a lining. She had asked them not to, but the name outlasted the asking, the way bark outlasts the tree that grew it, the way a floor outlasts the hands that laid it. Jonas Pike had said, "She's papering the dirt like it's a parlor wall." Years later, in the schoolhouse on a thaw day in early March, a child dropped a mitten onto the sanded floor. The mitten stayed dry. Outside, wagon ruts filled with black water, and the yard softened to mud. Inside, children copied sums on slates with their boots planted over pale bark they could not see and did not think about and did not need to think about, because the floor did what it was supposed to do, and the best things in a life are the things that work so well they disappear. The floor looked like dirt. Underneath, it remembered the river.